Welcome to my channel. My name is Sevgi Akarçeşme. I'm an exile journalist based in the United States. I had to leave my home country, Turkey, due to pressure against our media organization and media freedom in general. Since then, I've been doing journalism as a hobby because I cannot continue as a professional journalist. But I'm happy to do this YouTube videos. Up until recently, I was doing this in Turkish, but I'm transitioning to hybrid. That's why I urge you to support my endeavor in my English content, and I would be happy if you subscribe, like, and share my videos. Today, I have a very important guest, and I'm very excited about it, Dr. Yohuru Williams. I met him a couple of years ago when he was asking me questions as a Huffington Post contributor, but he's much more than that. He's a frequent in national TV channels when it comes to issues of race in the United States and history of racism and beyond. He's a historian by training, but I would like to give the floor to him to introduce himself. Welcome to my channel, Dr. Williams.
Thanks for having me. It's great being with you again. We met under circumstances in a way that I think people wouldn't have thought about it. Ended up becoming the experience here in the United States for journalists. So it's great to be with you. It's great to see you using this platform to continue to reach people and to be very courageous in the way that you're taking on many of these issues. So nice to see you. And I am a professor of history, as you said, and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, which will sound familiar to some people because Minnesota, as of 2020, became the epicenter of a national, in fact, the global conversation about racial injustice and policing due to the murder of George Floyd in nearby Minneapolis. In fact, I live less than about 5 miles from where George Floyd was killed.
So I'm glad that you are diving into the subject right away, because today I'm hoping to enlighten our viewers, mostly outside of the United States, about what's going on in the United States when it comes to race. Because people, of course, have an idea. I mean, for Americans, this has always been here. It's part of their life, this debate. And this is one of the most contentious issues in the United States. And people are even afraid to talk about this because they are scared of the stigma. We often lack candid discussion on this because of political correctness, if you ask me. But for outsiders, it's mind-boggling. For outsiders like me, it's mind-boggling that as of 2022, we are still talking about racism in the United States. Why? Why is there still racism in the United States as of 2022?
I think because it's deeply embedded in the fabric of American society and culture, and there's been an unwillingness and a general inability to deal with those issues in concrete ways. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One is this idea that slavery ended any racial inequality, or the end of slavery signaled the end of racial inequality in the United States. And that argument goes, there was slavery, and then there was the Civil War and Reconstruction and 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And that created absolute equality for African Americans before the law. But the reality is that that moment that we associate with the Civil War and Reconstruction actually resulted in an undermining of that moment of opportunity. So the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was an unfinished revolution because it left the door open for other forms of involuntary servitude, which were then applied to African Americans exclusively. Sharecropping, the crop lien system, debt peonage are all ways in which slavery continued in the aftermath of the Civil War, disproportionately, in fact, singularly impacting African Americans. 14th Amendment confers citizenship on African Americans, birthright citizenship, and yet there were various efforts to restrict the meaning of citizenship for African Americans, denying them equal access to housing and education, and then basically clouding that or shrouding that under the cover of separate but equal in the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And the most visible today is in voting rights and all the efforts utilized in our contemporary moment to really tamp down on and dissuade African Americans from voting. And that's all about this fear of African Americans as a voting bloc and voting power and maintaining white supremacy in the United States. And we see that most concretely in states of the former Confederacy, Georgia, but we also see it in areas like Pennsylvania, where you have large cities that have large numbers of African Americans and where people in more rural communities want to maintain control.
I think one of the keywords that you use is fear. I was going to ask you when you were talking about all these, when it comes to people of color and Black specifically, why is there such a fear? Are whites or the establishment, are they scared of losing their privileges? What's this fear?
The narrative that you'll hear often, and this is very common on the right, is because African Americans are violent. There's this whole narrative about criminality, so on and so forth. The reality is that that fear is rooted in competition and a fear of a loss of privilege that would accompany granting full equality to people of color, namely African Americans. We saw this from the very beginning. I mean, it's when I say that it's embedded into the very fabric of American society and culture. The poorest white person always was able to look upon slaves and make the case that at the very least, their lot wasn't associated with these people who were lesser than they were, just by the virtue of the color of their skin. We see this in other societies and cultures. Certainly, we could look at India and the problem of the untouchables that occupy that type of position. But in the United States, that kind of racialized hierarchy in which even the lowest class of white person is superior to a Black person helped to create that sense of privilege.
That's a very important point, because whenever I talk to in private conversations, people who are leaning right, I don't mean to say all right-wing people are like that, but I'm giving examples. Whenever I talk about inequality, equality of opportunity, especially when it comes to education, property ownership, you name it. Everybody knows that there is such kind of inequality in the United States when it comes to races. But they often bring up the white poverty and say that, see, look at the white poor neighborhoods. Nobody really cares about them. Nobody talks about them because they are white, but they are poor for the same reasons that Blacks are poor. What would you say?
Well, it's interesting because during the 1960s, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference actually tried to build a movement to address poverty in this country based on the fact that poor whites, poor Blacks, poor people of color share a similar lot. But the reason that those efforts have always unraveled, we saw it at the turn of the century with populism in this country, these political movements that are built on the idea that poor people have more in common than these racial groups. But poor whites have always gravitated back to this idea that white supremacy and white privilege are more valuable, have greater currency than solidarity over economic issues.
Why, Dr. Williams? I mean, when you think rationally, it makes more sense to fight against the system as poor people from all walks of life. But why do they fall into this trap? Do they want to feel somewhat superior? What's the reason? Is it just this embedded racism in the fabric of the United States?
Well, I think that superiority also comes from what I mentioned in the very beginning, is this lack of competition. The American dream, if it's construed by poor whites, is I have the access or the opportunity to access all these things that I associate with wealth, a home, a great education, being able to pass things on to my children. And if I'm doing that, not competing with African Americans, with Asian Americans, with Jews or Hindus, I mean, this kind of diverse tapestry of colored in the United States, that gives me greater access to those things. It's often not framed in that way, but the reality is, and we see this, count in many manifestations of American history, poor whites chasing Blacks out of white neighborhoods, not because they could buy that house, but because they are defending the principle that home ownership in this neighborhood is restricted to whites. That means that my American dream guarantees me access to that, but denies you and everyone who's not like me the same access.
But why? What would they lose if there is a mixed neighborhood?
Everything, because part of that is then tied to this notion that the white race is superior. That's where we get into these notions of, racial superiority that are, again, deeply embedded in the fabric of American society and culture that really owe themselves to the racist ideology that had to accompany slavery from the very beginning. You had, for example, the Christian church has to confront the fact that, how do you justify the existence of slavery? You come up with a narrative that these people are, degraded race or degraded people, and that sticks. So even as we move forward, that those notions have been very difficult to dislodge, and they definitely help to justify and authenticate that hatred and fear of people of color.
So it's institutionalized.
Absolutely.
I know these are really, really deep and broad issues, but I want to ask another question that's been, keeping my mind busy for a while. I'm an immigrant, and I love this country despite everything, because compared to Europe and other parts of the world, for a Muslim immigrant woman, this is the friendliest country on earth, in my opinion, at least along with Canada, maybe, because I lived in Belgium, and I know that being an immigrant in Europe is much harder because of the maybe uniformity of those societies when it comes to ethnicity, race, religion. So I'm happy to be an immigrant in the United States, because this has been a country which is based on immigration. And when it comes to immigration, this is a pretty tolerant country. It's ironic, in my opinion, that this country, which is very welcoming to foreigners and immigrants, is displaying racism to people who are indigenous to this society. Why? How do you explain this irony? How do you explain this discrepancy? I hope my question makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And when you think about it in this context, America is colonized by European powers that are then obviously not hostile to immigration, because kind of embedded in their origin is the story of immigration. The French, the English, the Dutch all come to the United States and establish colonies here, and they recognize the value of immigration toward innovation, toward business, toward community. It also provides an opportunity for intermarriage and kind of cultural connection in ways that aren't taboo. With the African in particular and the native peoples, that is problematized by the fact that if you intermarry with those people, but you're using them as your cheap source of labor, they then represent a challenge to your authority, and they represent a challenge to your ability to be the most profitable in those endeavors, which give you an advantage that you would have had in Europe when you were, basically part of the lowest class, and you're escaping that to come someplace where you can build privilege. But in order to do that, you need that lower class to serve your needs. Natives and African Americans serve that purpose for so much of American history, African Americans in particular, that it's hard to give that up. So there's plenty of discriminatory behavior toward immigrants in the U.S. history that we can point to. However, immigrants have always also been able to otherize African Americans and Native Americans in a way that says, at the very least, I'm not suffering from the same restrictions that are imposed on that group of people. In the 1920s, there's a great book by a gentleman named Ian Haney Lopez entitled White by Law. And in that book, Lopez talks about all the immigrant groups who had gone to the U.S. Supreme Court in the period of the 19-teens and 1920s, trying to have themselves legally declared white. Because the idea of whiteness, Grace Hale talks about this, is property. So to be an immigrant, but to then be able to claim that one is white, gives one then access to that American dream that is still cut off for the people who are of the darker races. And that's how those work in tandem.
I have so many questions, but I just want to keep them as short as possible, because, as you talk, I can relate to so many points. For example, my husband, who works in corporate America and who speaks with an accent, believes that there is discrimination against people who are speaking with an accent, or immigrants, but nobody really talks about it because they don't have a lobby. I don't know, that's his opinion. But basically, my point is, he is convinced that when it comes to promotion, white Americans are always prioritized, even though in paper all the different groups and diverse groups are employed. When it comes to promotion, even if you are more qualified and more hardworking or do better than those, when it comes to promotion, for some reason, white Americans tend to promote. Of course, I don't know if there is a scientific study, but when you talk about this racism or discrimination against different groups, it makes me think that racism in the United States is not only particular to Black Americans. What would you say?
Well, I would say, it goes back to the, classic work done by people like Gordon Allport, but even in our contemporary moment, all the work that's done on issues such as implicit bias. For immigrants, what easily marks them as other is those visible things, names, for example, speaking with an accent, if someone wears a hijab, anything that makes it easy for me to identify you as an other allows me to discriminate against you. White immigrants, so-called white immigrants, have always been able to escape that by virtue of changing a last name, adopting a different faith, learning to speak without an accent, intermarrying in a way that gives you access that would have been denied to a person of color who can't do any of those things because the veil of blackness, skin color, immediately marks them as the other. W.E.B. Du Bois and others, talked about this at length. No matter how educated, how accomplished a Black person was, those same things would have been denied to them by virtue of the fact that the color of one's skin immediately establishes you as someone who is to be perpetually discriminated against. Not to say that immigrants don't face, in some cases, just as harrowing examples of discriminatory behavior, but they're able to kind of evolve out of that, so to speak. And I hate to use the word evolve, but the best example is John Kennedy. I mean, Irish American, there is, all kinds of discriminatory behavior toward Irish Americans. And yet within a generation, his father is able to amass enough wealth that John Kennedy, despite his Catholicism, which is a group that's targeted by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, is able to become president of the United States. And, it's not going to be till Barack Obama that that's a possibility for African Americans. And even with Obama's blackness became, part of the narrative that led to the rise of Trump, is that people were so destabilized by the fact that there was a Black president, they were willing to elect someone who was clearly a white supremacist.
If I remember correctly, I mean, this was not among my questions, but since you brought up Barack Obama, I think it was in his memoirs or Michelle Obama's at some point, they were even debating if the United States was not ready for Black president because of the repercussions. Do I remember correctly?
You are remembering that correctly. And it was, a question that, I think a number of scholars and pundits looked at is that would there be a backlash against the election of a Black president? We've seen this before in American politics. A famous, coup that took place in North Carolina, where they literally unseated a popularly elected government around the turn of the century in the 1890s because there were Blacks leading that government, to more contemporary, even the legacy of Reconstruction. And then Obama becomes the contemporary example of that. You saw politicians in this country on the far right willing to basically throw out the U.S. Constitution because they were so destabilized by the ascent of Black political power and the browning of America, the fact that they're no longer in the majority, that in the years to come, their influence will slip. And so you're seeing all these efforts to ensure and limit voting of people of color, to redraw district lines, to make other efforts to ensure that they maintain power. And that's why the Obamas talked about and others talked about, this fear of the inevitable backlash, or what actually Carol Anderson calls the white lash against Black empowerment.
Minorities, Hispanics, Blacks, or other minorities tend to grow faster than white Americans in the United States. Is this a concern for white supremacists?
Very much a concern for white supremacists. In fact, this is in many ways, the foundation of white supremacist ideology and this pushback. Charlottesville in 2017, the eve of that ugly episode that ended in the death of Heather Heyer, during the protests to remove those Confederate statues. Those protesters are chanting before that violent encounter takes place, "Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us." Now, who are they speaking to? They're talking about the browning of America, again, people of color, and the traditionally scapegoated and targeted groups in this country. More recently, although this has always been this strain in U.S. history, Muslim Americans. So, the response of the Trump administration, the Muslim ban, building a wall. This is all out of the playbook of let's keep those who are different from us out under the auspices of fabricated or exaggerated claims about criminality or terrorism or, cultural differences, all of which serve the interest of white supremacy. Let's keep this a white country because if we do, you don't have to compete with these people. And, that's, at the core, there's an economic incentive There's social value in being able to be elevated in that way. And then there's political capital in that you get to set the agenda.
Race is one of the most difficult issues to debate in the United States because people are scared to be labeled as racist, scared of being canceled, this cancel culture and all. But I sometimes come across certain debates on Twitter, on the internet, and right-wing media, sort of putting the blame on Blacks and people of color in the United States when it comes to racism. They sometimes talk about this victimhood. I remember seeing Charles Barkley, an NBA player, Black NBA player, who has been criticizing Black communities in the United States as well. As far as I can see, he, of course, recognizes racism in the United States, but also he says that as Blacks, we have to work on our own issues, such as crime within Black neighborhoods. And some right-wing people also say that, oh, when a police kills a Black person, it's a big issue, but Blacks kill each other every day. It's comparing apples and oranges, in my opinion, I believe. But I'm just curious, it would be, our conversation would be missing if I didn't ask you this dimension of this subject. What about this victimhood psychology in Black or communities or people of color? What would you say? Is it counterproductive?
It's counterproductive because it's intellectually dishonest. And what ends up happening is that any community within that community is going to talk about challenges to that community. So you find this in immigrant groups, kind of looking at those folks who are on the margins and what contributes to what we would associate with not only criminality, but behaviors that we don't associate with the kind of highest level. We call it the politics of respectability. So, why does Dr. Williams speak so well and, is purchased a home and spends his money wisely, and these people don't, and so therefore these people are beneath me, and it invites commentary on these people's behavior. We saw comedian Bill Cosby, before he was exposed, engaging in this rhetoric about pull your pants up, and African Americans need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And it goes back to this impulse that we saw at the turn of the century with people like Booker T. Washington of, if we only demonstrate that we're respectable, white people will accept us, and then the keys to the kingdom and all the benefits of American society and culture will be available to us. The reality is there's always been a talented tenth in our contemporary movement, even more than that, of people who meet that, who are still killed by police, who are still subject to racist laws, who are still living in a society in which, in some instances, just coming home to your house or going for a walk in the park invites people to treat you as a suspect. So those arguments don't really work.
I mean, it's the most recent example. For those people who are not familiar with the content, a young Black boy was killed just because some racist people were suspicious of him, and he was totally unarmed. And this is when I can't even imagine being a young Black boy in the United States.
Well, and it affects the entire community, because then, it's the death of that child or that male. But then what about the family that's left to deal with the fallout from that loss of, income, the loss of that person, the intergenerational harm that's communicated, and then the feeling on the part of the African American community as a whole that who cares enough about this to do anything to push for the policy changes, the procedural changes to create real equity in our society. So that's kind of, the first part of that is that narrative is often blown out of proportion by people who are looking for an excuse to say, we don't need to be worried about this because look at Black on Black crime. Well, if we look at this sociologically and you look at the evidence, white people kill white people, Black people kill Black people because, intimate partner violence and people basically commit crimes in communities where, they live in large numbers. So that actually points to how segregated our society is, more than it points to this as an example of African Americans engaged in more criminal behavior. It's actually been the easiest kind of paper straw man to throw up to say, this is why African Americans don't have these things, because they are obsessed with crime and they don't teach their children the right values, so on and so forth. Same arguments were made against Mexicans in this country. At one point, this was the popular way of denying Asian immigrants access to. So it's just part of an old American playbook, but that playbook was written in the blood of Black people, of African Americans. And then last but not least, when you talk about the kind of cancel culture, it's not that, and this is fair. We as a society have lost our ability to have critical conversations about sensitive subjects, primarily because there is this fear about the polarizing impact of tackling the issues in a way that will require accountability. And so what ends up happening is, if we have that conversation, who's accountable for the fallout? So people tend to resort to the old paper, the straw men, right? It's Black crime. We don't want to talk about reparations because the owners of the slave owners are dead. Never mind the fact that we could be talking about something like the destruction of Black communities just 50 years ago, when they ran major federal highways through the heart of, here in St. Paul and Wilmington, Delaware, and other places, through the heart of thriving Black communities. So, I think that becomes the way in which people deflect from the larger issues of, that doesn't explain voting irregularities and redistricting. It doesn't explain January 6th. It doesn't explain the rise of Trump. And it certainly doesn't explain, when people kind of look at Donald Trump and why people are willing to overlook those elements of his immorality personally, to then make the case that they're doing this because they would rather have someone like that in the White House than deal with the accountability for racial practices, anti-immigration, in terms of Mexicans, African Americans, Muslims, in ways that we often don't connect the dots. And you'll often find people from those communities attacking other people within the minority community, not building what Dr. King called the beloved community and saying, hey, wait a minute, we're all in the same boat, because we're all being victimized, as you talked about your husband, by these types of behaviors, these policies, these practices and procedures, which deny people the opportunity to contest for and contend for the American dream as we see it. And it's going to be a little bit different than the way that white supremacists see it.
Despite everything, when I look at your media appearances, at least in some of them, I was surprised to see you optimist when it comes to, because you think that change is incremental. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I always personally, I'm comparing the United States, the rest of the world, and in any case, this is a society which is able to face its mistakes in history, relatively speaking. That's why I always prefer being here than other places, on earth. I mean, my home country, Turkey, is not even able to face the Armenian genocide and other even, less egregious crimes in its history. But when it comes to the United States, there is some level of recognition. Is this why you are hopeful towards future?
I think that's at the core why I am. I think the United States has a lot of sins to account for as a nation. I don't think that the United States is perfect. I think that we are in the process of perfecting our democracy and democratic practice. In fact, I think that we're probably at the precipice now of it being more vulnerable than at any time in our history, which makes it important to have the viewpoint that you just shared and my viewpoint that incremental change means that I can recognize that it is great that you and I, who 100 years ago would not have been able to have this conversation, we would have been, two people would have been, for multiple reasons, denied the opportunity to engage in this, have a platform to do that, and people welcome those views, and we're not barred from that. So that means that I can look back 100 years and say that's progress, and I'm happy for that. Doesn't mean that there's more work that doesn't need to be done. I think that we just have to gear up to do that work and do it in a meaningful way that says, what do we want the society to look like in 20 years, and work toward that, than being so discouraged by what exists now than to believe that now is what it's going to be like forever. If that was the case, we'd still be living under segregation, or we'd still be living under slavery. Or when women didn't have the right to exercise the right to vote, or when, quite frankly, when Italian Americans were lynched, the second largest group behind African Americans lynched in this country. And the numbers for African Americans are staggering. Italians don't even approach that, but you can certainly see the discriminatory practice in that. And so I kind of live for that world, and that's where my hope comes from. I'll also say that I think that it was one of the reasons I'm keenly aware of Turkey, why I was so inspired by your courage in that moment to be taking on these issues, because we live in a global world now. So our reluctance or inability to recognize the interconnectedness of our struggles. The Arab Spring is a great example of that, which basically was the inspiration for Occupy Wall Street. We can't talk about sovereign borders anymore because platforms like Twitter and YouTube give us the opportunity to reach the globe. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, for example, I was invited on Australian television, and the journalist, it was their Good Morning America program. And I talked about what happened here. And as soon as the program was over, my social media was inundated by activists in Australia who were saying, thank you for coming on and talking about the problem in the United States, but we need you to understand that the problem here is just as bad as it is in the United States. Indigenous people here are dying by police. In fact, one activist, female activist, reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, did you know that over 400 Indigenous people have died in police custody in Australia since 1992, the most recent one being on Christmas Day before George Floyd? His last words were, I can't breathe. If you ever get a chance to come back on Australian television again, please share that, because they need to know we're not just protesting for George Floyd. They're using George Floyd to say, isn't it great that problem doesn't exist here? And we're saying, no, we're interested in that because that is our story. About a year later, I got a chance to go back on Australian television, and about 3 minutes into the interview, I said, well, we should be talking about this as a global problem because, did you know? So I will never be invited back on Australian television, but I thank those activists for reminding all of us that it's a global village. So we incrementally not only fight this problem or challenge the United States, we hope that across borders it'll lead to leveling change in other spaces.
Yeah, through a friend in Australia, I was really shocked to learn the degree of racism and white supremacism in Australia, but that's a whole other debate. Now, going back to the United States versus Turkey, just because of the process I went through, I'm really worried about the future of American democracy when it comes to accountability, tolerance, being able to have candid and open debates. But as a historian, you have a more comprehensive view, and I can understand where you are coming from. So you are looking at history as a trajectory. I have one last question, Dr. Williams. In concrete terms, what do Blacks or people of color want in the United States? What do they want to change? What could we change altogether, as of 2022?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because it's often asked in a way that implies that what I would imagine African Americans want would apply to all African Americans because there's such diversity.
Even when I was asking the question, I was kind of thinking, oh my God, I am falling into the same trap, just categorizing a group of people and assuming that they all want the same thing. Of course they don't. I should have just formulated my question better, I guess.
But actually, I think it's a good question in this sense. I think there are some things when you alluded to, and you're the perfect example of this. We all want a free press because we believe that a free press means that we have access to information, that we can hold people accountable. We would all like opportunity to work unencumbered by policies and practices and procedures that punish rather than reward the job that we do, as opposed to what our names are, or what we look like, or how we speak. We all want access to affordable housing and safe neighborhoods. I think those things transcend race. And often with African Americans, with immigrants, it's framed as if, what we desire is somehow alien to, it's what we celebrate in America. It's what America promises and very rarely lives up to. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think one of the reasons that democracy has thrived and endured in America is because of the immigrant experience, because immigrants come with the experience of what it's like someplace else, and they fight and claw harder for the principles we associate with American democracy, sometimes than the folks that are born here, who become lazy in the way that they think about the privilege of what it means to live in a free and open society. And they share that with African Americans and Indigenous people, Native Americans, because we know intimately the experience of what a lack of freedom or denial of freedom looks like. But I think we have to work harder at building those, celebrating our diversity, building those international connections, recognizing us. And when you say that, people, kind of discount you as being, you're pie in the sky and it's Pollyanna and you're that'll never happens. We're doing it now. I learned so much from what was happening in Turkey, and that was transformative in my own thought. But I was also only opened up to that because of everything that happened during the Arab Spring and looking how that changed the discourse in this country about economic inequality and what people could accomplish via the use of social media. So I think we're all involved in this enterprise of, creating a world in which we would all feel safer, healthier, better, more supported. And I think that's the common dream.
Dr. Williams, I truly appreciate your time and your contribution to my channel. Thank you so much.
Great seeing you.
Just a quick reminder to our viewers, please do not forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video if you liked it. I hope to see you next time. Thanks.